This is Tony Franklin here. Well, where's he from? Was the firm? Jimmy Page and Paul Rogers? Back in the big head days. You just play that rock and roll with Joe Kay. Okay?
Oh yeah, just call me Joe, and I can play that rock and roll for you.
Because just a year later, he released his next album, which some of you may know the title track from, Abracadabra.
Abracadabra, I wanna reach out and grab you. Abracadabra, abracadabra.
Abracadabra was Steve Miller's last time on the top of the charts. This was a huge hit record. And, of course, the single was number one all over the place. It was his last number one. I guess that would have been his third number one hit single. Very successful. The music for the Abracadabra, the single, was recorded back in the mid-70s when he was working on Fly Like an Eagle and Book of Dreams. Abracadabra, the song, is at least in part sort of a tribute to Diana Ross and the Supremes. The rest of this music on this album does not sound really much like Circle of Love at all. The songs here are much more pop. They're much more polished. And the reason this was more polished, more pop music, is because 8 out of the 10 tracks here were written by the drummer I mentioned earlier, Gary Malaber, and his musical partner, Kenny Lee Lewis. Kenny Lee Lewis later joined the Steve Miller Band, and he told the Washington Times, I'm going to read you this quote he told the Washington Times in 2015. Kenny Lee Lewis said, "In 1981, I started working on the Abracadabra record with Steve at Capitol Records with Gary Malaber, who I was in a band with at the time. Gary had played with Steve on drums. Steve was looking for material. We sent him our 8 demos, hoping he would cover one. He ended up taking all 8 of them. We ended up co-writing and co-producing the whole album." So, Gary Malaber and Kenny Lee Lewis put together 8 demos, and they go to Steve and they say, "Hey, we hear you need some music," and they're crossing their fingers, hoping he listens through it and takes one, and Steve just goes, "Yep, I'll take it all. I'll take the whole thing. We'll make that the record." I love this story. I think it's fair. I mean, some people would think that's kind of lazy, but these aren't bad songs. I could see why you'd want at least a couple of them. But this was very much a collaborative record between Steve, Gary, and Kenny Lee Lewis. And I don't mean to make it sound like Steve just bought 8 songs and didn't contribute anything to them himself. I'm sure he contributed some lyrics or music to it. I'm just not privy to whatever that information is. And sure enough, I'm looking right here on the back. It says produced by Steve Miller and Gary Malaber. So he puts out the record, enjoys some success with it, and goes out on the road for a 2-year tour. But I guess from what I've heard at the time, the tour wasn't terribly successful. I guess he had a hard time selling tickets. My dad told me he saw this tour. My dad is a bit of a Steve Miller fan. Of course, he likes the stuff from the 70s. My dad absolutely hates this song. He hates Abracadabra, has nothing good to say about this record. So, you know, he said his memories of the show when he saw Steve Miller at Milwaukee's Summerfest in 1982, he said it was a fun show except when he played Abracadabra. And, you know, Abracadabra is one of those tracks that Steve has gotten beat up for a lot, you know, for a stretch in the early 2000s. I recall watching a lot of VH1 in high school, And I remember several VH1 retrospective shows like I Love the 80s where they would talk about this song, and the comedians would always come down really hard on this one. I remember they riff on it in I Love 1982. There was another special, and you can find these on YouTube now, but VH1's 40 Most Awesomely Bad Number 1 Hit Songs. This was number 22 on that list.
It's 1982, and I think Steve Miller Band is like, okay, it's the 80s now, so gotta bump it up a notch. And they came out with Abracadabra.
Steve Miller was cool, and then all this Abracadabra. It's like, I don't know, a good one went down.
This song, sort of like Eye of the Tiger and The Final Countdown and We Built the City on Rock and Roll, have sort of all been made the poster children of bad, overproduced records from the 80s. Now, since that era, these songs have sort of been rediscovered, reclaimed by rock fans, and fans aren't afraid to celebrate these songs anymore, which I absolutely do. I don't like anything ironically. I genuinely love both Abracadabra and the record, the track and the record. And then the last thing I will say about Abracadabra is that this album coincided with MTV becoming a major force in the musical landscape. And the music video for Abracadabra is not a good one. It's a lot of magicians doing magic tricks, a lot of cringy effects. It's not a fun watch. I mean, you can look at it once and be like, oh, yeah, okay, this is kind of dumb. And that's probably a big part of why this was kind of the last big commercial hit for Steve Miller, because this was around the time that video killed the radio star. MTV destroyed as many careers as it made. And Steve was a very popular radio act that really just couldn't make the transition to video.
Anywhere you go, your MTV stays with you. MTV Music Television. Don't get caught without it. Your first video music channel. Take MTV to go.
I have this book called I Want My MTV. It was released in 2011. And the only mention in the whole book of Steve Miller is comedian Dave Holmes, who says, I love how acts who were huge before MTV tried to adapt and couldn't. Like Abracadabra by Steve Miller, which was a huge song. Oh, stop it. You're making a fool of yourself. He just seemed too old. He was probably in his late 30s. So, a passing mention in a very dismissive way, and that whole part of the chapter is just kind of going through some artists who had a really hard time adjusting to the video age of pop music, which was the 80s and 90s.
Hope you're doing great, and best of luck with your new podcast, Rock the World with it.